and welcome back to Talking Absolute Worship. And we are continuing to watch the year unfold, and we're getting to the end of August, beginning of September, and we find ourselves in proper 17 with 4 more texts to explore and chew over. And I'm delighted to be joined by 2 fabulous explorers and not least chewers over of biblical text. I hope they take that in all the right ways. And we're going to see where this journey takes us. And we're going to start with Alex. Alex, for these various texts for this Sunday, any particular thoughts, things that are jumping out for you?
Absolutely. So a reminder for folks who watch regularly that I work mainly outside of the church and with those on the edge of church. And for me, one of the things that really struck me in these readings, and I should say, I guess my focus was a lot on the Romans passage and the Matthew passage. And for me, one of the things that I was really aware of when coming to these readings was the amount of suffering that's involved in these readings, and the amount of speaking about injustice and how to respond to it that's involved in these readings. And one of the things I probably haven't mentioned before in this series about the people that I work with is that most of the people that I work with have experienced trauma. And for some of them, that's trauma in church circumstances. So for me, when I'm thinking about speaking about texts like these, I'm really thinking about what might sometimes be described as trauma awareness, but is now more often described as compassionate awareness. So how can we speak about these texts in ways that are compassionate with those who have experienced trauma? So firstly, in our story from Matthew, we meet Peter in denial. He's kind of not willing to accept that it might all be okay, that actually Jesus will be killed as a result of his life speaking out for justice and peace, speaking truth to power. So we hear Jesus kind of challenging Peter to accept that something bad is going to happen, something difficult is going to happen. This isn't, in my mind, a text that's primarily about resurrection, although resurrection does come through a little bit at the end. It seems to me to be much more about Jesus asking Peter to accept that there is going to be suffering. Often today, when people are suffering, we're very tempted, and we do this in church, but it happens outside of the church as well. I've seen it in all sorts of contexts. We're really, really tempted when people are suffering to meet them with platitudes, this sort of, oh, it will all be okay. And I think that that's kind of an angle that I'd like to come at these readings from, because I think that these readings challenge that platitude. Jesus isn't saying, well, it will all be okay. Jesus is saying, no, I need you to accept that for this moment, at least, it's not okay. And so I think we need to bring some realism to this reading, some understanding of trauma theory, which talks about needing to be with people in their suffering. So not trying to move straight to resurrection, not trying to shift the view straight to the hope, but actually saying we're going to be with Jesus and with Peter in this moment. Now, there's a danger that slips into glorifying suffering. So if you want to get out some deep theology here, you could look at Marcella Althus-Reed. She's a Latin American liberation theologian, and she talks about the way that suffering is sometimes used as theology's object of exchange. So basically her critique there is that we sometimes talk about suffering as if it's something that God uses to buy salvation. And that if we talk about suffering in that way, we're really demeaning the experiences of those who suffer. But actually, we do still need to not deny suffering or try to paper over the cracks. We need to witness to it honestly. To go from another perspective than theology, we could go to counseling theory. So Carl Rogers came up with the term unconditional positive regard, which is about trying to be with people just as they are. And a kind of church-based practical theory that builds on the same approach as appreciative inquiry. And both of them are sometimes criticized by people who assume that they're about false positivity. But actually, they're not. They're not just about seeing the good. They're about seeing the reality and being honest about it. So to me, this reading speaks to seeing the reality of crucifixion and being able to be honest about it. And I think that that gives us roots into talking honestly about some of the things about how it is to be church, how it is to be in society today. In our reading from Matthew, we have the kind of well-known and often quoted phrase, take up your cross. And in light of everything that I've just said, that's one that I'd want to think about really carefully when I was preaching, because sometimes that is a phrase that's used to glorify suffering, to say that we suffer so that we are saved. So for me, this take up your cross isn't necessarily about glorifying suffering, but can also be seen as being about acknowledging it, that Jesus is perhaps asking people to allow others to see the ways in which they suffer, because we all have areas of suffering in our lives, but in our current social context, we tend to try to hide them. We tend to think that we can't talk about our suffering. So I think I might come at taking up your cross from that angle of how can we be more honest with each other about the things that are not okay, which kind of leads me into Romans, because Romans, to me, this passage from Romans is all about Paul talking to the community about what to do when they're persecuted. And a lot of people, when they suffer, they experience that suffering as a result of persecution. And Paul, speaking into this, what to do when you're persecuted, tells the community to honor one another above yourselves. But I think it's important to kind of delve into how Paul talks about doing that, so that it doesn't again sound like this, let's just completely deny ourselves and experience lots of trauma. But actually, Paul talks about honesty, about being with. So be joyful in hope, be patient in affliction, and be faithful in prayer. It's really important that we don't kind of cross wires here and suggest that Paul's suggesting that we should be joyful in affliction. Actually, this is about being honest about where we are. Paul goes on to say that we should share with people who are in need. We should practice hospitality, both kind of clear things that we can do to speak into suffering, to be with people when they're suffering, but then goes on to this bit about blessing those who persecute you. And that's where, again, as someone who works with people who have experienced trauma, I begin to struggle with this passage and to think, okay, how am I going to talk about blessing those who persecute you without simply implying that oppression is okay and that we shouldn't do anything to change some of the unjust things about the world in which we live? And when I was looking at this, I got a little bit intertextual again, and I was thinking about Luke, because this is a really close passage to where in Luke, Jesus says, "But I say to those of you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who abuse you." In context, that can sound like almost exactly the same message, but we have to remember that in Luke, that comes just after the Beatitudes. And because it comes just after the Beatitudes, it complexifies the idea of what blessing people means. So I feel like sometimes when we look at this passage from Romans alone, we think that blessing those who persecute you means being nice to those who persecute you. But when you set that against the context of the Beatitudes, in the Beatitudes, we're told that people who suffer are blessed. So that really complexifies this sense of blessing being about being nice. And I wonder if in the context of our reading about Peter needing to accept Jesus's crucifixion, and in the context of contemporary suffering, perhaps we can talk about blessing others by being honest, blessing others by speaking honestly about contemporary suffering. Now, that doesn't necessarily condone hatred or violence or so on against people who persecute. I'm not necessarily taking this to its furthest extreme, but I do think that there's a message in there about what blessing means, and that perhaps we can bless people by being honest with them, even when those words of honesty are particularly challenging. I would want in all of what I've said to relate this to contemporary struggles and contemporary suffering. Some of those will be different in every context, but I thought I might just briefly mention a few of the things that I might talk about in my context, some of which will be relatable to yours, and others of which you might want to think about what's going on where you are. So I might talk about the cost of living crisis. That's one that's definitely relatable everywhere. I might talk about land justice. So in Cambridge, who owns land and how it's used is a really big question that we often talk about when we talk about suffering and persecution. I might talk about the underfunding of community initiatives, lack of safe space for people in varying demographics, but in Cambridge, particularly for single parents and young parents, for LGBTQ plus folks, and for folks who are suffering with mental health difficulties. Those are particular areas in which, if you're not in the university, there are challenges. So I might speak into what these readings mean in that context. And finally, I might want to speak into what these readings mean in the context of culture wars, particularly culture wars that sometimes seem one-sided, and thinking about what it means in a context of culture war to bless those who persecute us by being honest about some of the suffering. So yeah, those are some of the places that I might go to. You might go to different places based on your context, but I just want to kind of repeat what I said at the beginning, that we should really think about trauma when we're talking about these readings, and realize that in every congregation, there will be people who have experienced trauma, and we will want to care for them when talking about things that are traumatic.
Yeah. That's incredibly powerful and very moving, Alex. Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, those of us who joined us for the previous week, we were dwelling a little bit on the fact that Matthew does this interesting thing with this whole encounter with who do you say that I am? We get to where Mark gets to with the Peter doing the oh no, not suffering surely. But we've also, on the way, Matthew has given us all of that stuff about Peter is the rock, and on the rock, and you're going to loose and bind, and so on. And it's interesting that now Jesus continues. There's this sense, as you've touched on, of this sort of he's amplifying the truth of what this journey, this way is, and it's absolutely this way that is going to be tough in the present in a way that you can't just brush aside. And as you were talking, I was struck. I mean, I love the way you kind of interleave the Matthew and the Romans. I was struck also at the very end of the Romans text, where we get that very, again, one of those lines that we hear, and I mean, I'm very conscious of what you've highlighted about platitudes and the danger of platitudes. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And I mean, again, the danger of that, and thinking not least of kind of pastorally, the danger of the number of ways in which people can be presented with well, just put up with it, or don't challenge this situation. And there's a wonderful critique, I think, of sort of a lot of pastoral practical theology, which is is the danger that we try to equip people to put up with and cope with whatever it is that they're dealing with, and we don't and it's been important, not least, I mean, you brought in that liberationist voice. I mean, I think of some of the womenist, feminist theologians as well, whose critique would be, but hang on a minute, how do we actually also say there are things that happen that are evil and wrong and bad, and I would want to be very cautious and careful, but I wonder if, and I suppose I'm thinking of some of the sort of the civil rights movement stuff and the peace movement stuff, about the fact that actually one of the ways in which we begin to maybe tilt people towards goodness and away from evil is by not being willing to adopt the means that they adopt. And I was thinking, I think, was it Michelle Obama, her famous phrase, when they go low, we go high, as she was reflecting on with her daughters, I think, on how they had coped with some of the racist abuse that they had suffered as a family. And I wonder if there's a sense in this also of, I mean, I was thinking as you were talking about, say, culture wars, where, I mean, I'm like you and others, I bang out the odd tweet every now and again, and Twitter is a venue for the culture wars, where people say the most incredible things and the most brutal put downs and so on. And I wonder if there is I mean, that's a mission field where we might want to say, I'm going to put across my opinion and I'm going to fight my corner, but I refuse to enter into that level of way of doing it. I want to use the tool, but I want to use it in a more positive way. Is that something that might resonate as well, do you think?
Absolutely. And I mean, so one of the decisions, talking about culture wars in particular, and I'm going to try and work out how this might relate to the readings because you never know. But talking about culture wars in particular, one of the things that I've chosen to do is to stop debating. So
Right.
I never debate. And that is because debating often turns into a shouting match. It's whose voice is louder and it's who has the best insults. So I will tell my truth, and I will discuss with others and I will hear other people's truths. But what I won't do is go into a scenario where the intention is to argue um, back and forth with each other in that way. I guess I wonder if there's something in there about this blessing those who persecute you is about refusing to enter into that
Mm.
co-persecution. And I think in the field of debate, often what we actually do is persecute each other by taking cheap shots, which aren't actually speaking the truth to power.
Mm.
They're just insulting each other. Whereas blessing is actually about saying, here's my truth. I'm going to bless you by sharing my truth and ideally my vulnerable or painful truths with you. And I'm going to bless you by listening when you share your vulnerable and painful truths with me. And let's
Yeah.
not try to change each other as we
Yeah.
do that. Let's actually just share and listen.
Mm.
Um, that's possibly a little tangential, but I think might be relevant.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, isn't it, that of course, and I mean, again, context is so important, isn't it? I mean, both in the Romans and in the Matthew, we've got authors who are writing into their context as well. They are, and their context is, Judaism, the emergence of this new thing that will become Christianity, the Roman Empire, the persecutions of all of those elements, the ways in which, slavery is written into the situation, all sorts of things contextually that are informing how they are doing their theology. And, when Jesus is talking about crucifixion, he's saying something that people know what that is. In a way, we turn it into all sorts of other things. He's talking about literal nails being hammered through bodies on bits of wood. And I think it's important, isn't it? How do we take that into our context, whether that's outside the church or in a church congregation, um, whose experiences will also be, as you've highlighted, filled with wrestling and sadness and suffering, and in some instances, real persecution, real abuse. Um, so thank you. We've already started to unpack a huge amount of stuff. We're going to turn to Blair, who may want to continue to take us into Romans and into Matthew, but I would just gently remind us that the Bible includes another whole set of Hebrew scriptures that we might want to delve into too. So anyway, Blair, how about for you?
Well, yeah, I do want to take us further into Romans and Matthew, but let me make a couple of comments about the Psalm and
Yeah,
the reading from Jeremiah, which I found in both cases uh, a bit too self-centered or self-interested or self-preservation minded for me. So the Psalm, we're talking about Psalm 26 verses 1 to 8. It's about me, vindicate me, uh, says the psalmist to the Lord. For I have walked with integrity. I have trusted in the Lord without prayer. Prove me, O Lord, and try me. Test my heart and my truth. I do not sit with false men. I hate the company of evildoers. Verse 6, I wash my hands in innocence. Verse 8, O Lord, I love the habitation of thy house. And I found it just both there and in Jeremiah. So Jeremiah 15 to 21, O Lord, beginning at verse 15, O Lord, thou knowest, remember me and visit me and take vengeance for me upon my persecutors, get them. In my forbearance, take me not away, nor know that for thy sake I bear reproach. Thy words were found, and I ate them. Thy words became to me a joy and a delight in my heart. I did not sit in the company of merrymakers, verse 17. Uh, I sat alone because thy hand was upon me. Verse 18, why is my pain unceasing? Well, that's sort of what interesting change there, but it just is, there's a lot of concern about me in both texts, I think, and a little bit of what a good boy am I. uh I'm doing the right things, um and in fairness, I guess the Psalms speak for us, don't they? They speak our human uh, frustrations and doubts, and even a bit of anger towards God at times, which represents what we really go through. So the psalmists are often more honest than we are ourselves in expressing our, why is the world like it is, and why isn't life working out exactly the way I want it to. uh and those thoughts need to be expressed, because they're certainly what we feel
yeah,
sometimes about the way life is, and so we can kind of get behind the those writers when they write in that way, because if we're honest, that's the way we feel ourselves. uh the world is a bit awry, and I've been doing my best to be faithful, and yet even then it doesn't seem to cash out sometimes for me, if indeed it's supposed to cash out, and I think that gets challenged in Matthew, certainly, and maybe to some extent in Romans as well, that we should never have expected it to cash out, or to give us what we wanted in the sense of power, or the things of this world.
mm.
Um, so there's a kind of not rightness, or a feeling of you only have to read the news to know the terrible things that are going on in the world. The sinking of that ship in the Mediterranean, where 100 children apparently were in the hull of the boat, and there's a kind of feeling of, where was God when that was going on, or if that sort of God exists, where was he? And you can see why some people would say that sort of God doesn't exist.
Mm. Yeah.
And it makes us think about it's a kind of honest grappling with life, and life is much more jagged and discomforting and problematic than we're sometimes comfortable with. And the psalmist, in a way, says that for us.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of that in Jeremiah as well. Now, I really like what Alex had to say in terms of there's all kinds of subtleties and contradictions in our faith, isn't there? Because we can say one thing, that there's a real truth about it. We celebrate that truth, but in that truth, there's often it can be taken the wrong way, or it can go in the wrong direction. And so another truth also needs to be said. And I think that was part of what Alex was saying for me, that in our desire to say that in following Jesus we have to take up our crosses, that there's a real danger in saying every cross is good, and whatever's happened to you, that's God's chosen business for you, so get on with it and suffer away. And that can't be right. And likewise in Romans, in saying we have to bless our enemies, or bless those who persecute us. What do we mean by that? Do we mean we should just keep on telling them they're great? And what is a blessing? And a blessing might be just telling them the truth, that getting them to recognize what's going on. And the last verse I find helpful. You drew attention to it, Neil. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The intent there is still to overcome the evil, isn't it? It is to overcome the evil. So that's the intent. It's just a matter sometimes of working out how you overcome it. and Paul is encouraging us not to go to the depths, as you say, of using the same kind of means that the evil ones, if that's the term we want to use of them, or our opponents are using.
Yeah.
So, I actually thought of Gandhi's. You were talking about the civil rights movement, but I thought of Gandhi's pacifism in the way that the empire was overcome in the end, or at least partly. As I saw the show Gandhi all those years ago with Ben Kingsley, it was very moving how it was passive resistance to what the soldiers were doing, and that is to say, they refused to be violent. When I say passive, I don't mean to say that they did nothing. They did a lot. But it was non-violent resistance. That's a better way of putting it. Sorry, passive is the wrong word. Non-violent resistance.
Yeah.
All of that said, the focus for me would come back to Matthew again.
Okay.
I do find myself preaching on the Gospels most often, I have to say, and I just love this text, which I think is right at the core of what it is to be a Christian. That this business of self-denial, I do think, is really at the core of our faith. I think it's all through the New Testament. Paul speaks about it. I think Philippians 2, have this mind amongst yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not think equality with God was a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and humbly accepted his lot, even the cross. And so I think Paul, wanted to say some things about the importance of self-denial. It's in all the Gospels. I read that Jesus speaks about self-denial in 4 times in Matthew, twice or 3 times in Luke, and 7 times in no, sorry, I got that wrong. 4 times in Matthew, 3 times in Mark, but 7 times in Luke. So it's this business of self-denial and taking up the cross and following him. Maybe that's the thing that needs to be emphasized, in the sense that it's not just about beating yourself up or self-denial for the sake of self-denial, but it's about following Jesus into new ways of life. Maybe that's the thing that, given what Alex said earlier, maybe that's the thing that needs to be accented upon: following Jesus, take up the cross and follow Jesus into new ways of life. But Bonhoeffer, of course, said that when Jesus calls someone, he invites them to come and die. Very strong language, and it was a theme, I think, that was felt pretty deeply by Christians. Those who read Bonhoeffer at the time felt that it was pretty compelling stuff, that Jesus invites to die to ourselves, die to all that's sinful about us, die to our own greed, die to our own longing to be at the top of the pecking order, in order that something better might be born in and through us, and in and through him. So it's a really, really powerful theme, I think, in Scripture, and it resonates in my own life, I have to say. You can understand why Peter didn't like it. I think none of us really like it. When you sign up to a movement that you believe in, and a leader who you really respect, you don't think at the beginning, like at first, it must have just when he called them on their fishing boats that day, it must have been just exciting at first. You would have thought, you don't think when you sign up to a movement and a leader that you're excited by, that one day, not very far down the road, he's going to say, by the way, all of this is going to come apart at the seams. My popularity is already on the wane. They're going to get me in the end, and by the way, we're all going to end up on crosses. We're all going to die. It's not the kind of thing that we receive well. And it's understandable why Peter wanted to kind of take him aside and say, we can avoid all this suffering if we do this another way. And Jesus says no to that suffering is part of it, and a kind of suffering that we choose, I guess.
Yeah.
So I don't know if what I've just said there is problematic for Alex. You can come back on that, but it seems to me that it is, that we take up crosses and follow him into new ways of life. That the cross is really at the heart of us, not just Jesus dying for us, but our call to serve and live in ways that are bound up with self-denial. So at the same time, as I want to say yes to what Alex said, it's not, we shouldn't be telling people that they're getting their just desserts, and or that they should just accept what they've been given. At the same time, I want to say that Christian life and Christian living has self-denial at the heart of it, and that Jesus invites us to take up our crosses and to follow him into new ways of life. Maybe that's
Yeah.
right.
Thank you, Blair. Alex.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to take up your invitation, but to say I don't disagree with you. Actually, for me, when talking about it, it would then be in the nuance of how I described what taking up your cross and what self-denial mean. And so for me, so for those listening, it will help you in context to understand that we're recording this in June, which is Pride Month. And so I've been talking a lot about pride and shame. And it's really interesting because the Bible uses the term pride in both negative and positive senses. And when the Bible uses the word pride in negative senses, it seems to be talking about self-sufficiency. And when the Bible uses the term pride in positive senses, it's always in community. So, for example, Paul, in a lot of his letters, talks about the community needing to have pride in each other. So, for me, in this kind of self-denial of taking up the cross, there is something there about acknowledging our reliance on each other, and not suggesting that we have everything that we need alone. So, I think there are ways to talk about self-denial and to talk about taking up our cross that still acknowledge that we're not just telling people to suffer for the sake of it, but actually, yes, to suffer for the sake of someone else. That's meaningful, and that's part of how we can be the body of Christ together. And it hurts and it costs. And if it didn't, we wouldn't be mirroring the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. Thank you. I wanted to also just linger briefly with the Jeremiah and the Psalm, just for the sheer fun of it, I guess. Partly, I mean, I think you're right there. I mean, I think when you first read both of these texts from the Hebrew Scriptures, there's an awful lot of I, me stuff, and you're right. It's very easy to kind of be put off. There's not more. Doesn't seem to be a lot of. Well, in the Psalm, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of humility around, and in the Jeremiah, there seems to be really an awful lot of sort of frustrated anger and hurt around. But then I suppose I found myself dwelling, and I mean, I think in what both of you have then done as you've taken us into the Romans and Matthew. I think I've also treasured in the Psalm and in the Jeremiah perhaps some insights into human experience and into honesty. One of the commentators I was reading was reflecting that the Psalm, and we don't know for absolute sure, of course, but one thought is that the context for the Psalm could be that this would be something to be recited by someone who has been falsely accused of something, and they have been vindicated. So they have been through a process, some sort of religious or legal process, at the end of which they have been seen to be falsely maligned or falsely accused, and they've been acquitted, and their integrity has been restored. And in that context, they then offer an act of worship. And in that act of worship, they perhaps say these words. And I think that's interesting, that maybe what we have here is we actually have a deposit of something that it's how ancient Israel handled an injustice. And this is the outcome of an injustice being put right. That someone who has been badly treated, falsely treated, is now being put right and is able to say for themselves, I wasn't wrong. I wasn't those things that people claimed I was. I was a faithful person. And that, in the context of what we've been talking about, I think is kind of interesting, that maybe in a way, what we have in Psalm 26 is we have a little deposit of actually how the community tried to handle injustice and wrong, false accusations, and how it found a way to say God is part of the restoration. But then the other thing that I was really struck by was the Jeremiah, and just here is the prophet absolutely laying into God. I mean,
Indeed.
in absolutely brutal ways. I've been your prophet. I've done the things that I was meant to do as a prophet, and it hurts. And it seems to me that's a text that sits powerfully alongside the take up your cross text. Because here
Yes.
is the prophet saying, okay, so I've done what you asked me to do, and to be perfectly honest, I do not like it, and I don't like where it's taken me. I haven't, I have stayed away from things that I should stay away from. I've taken your words in, I've eaten them. And when other people were having their wild parties, I've been on my own. And I've been indignant about all sorts of things. Why is my pain unceasing, my wound incurable, refusing to be healed? And then I thought the killer line, imagine how often in our prayer life, how often in our worship in our churches,
Indeed.
do we turn to God and say, truly, you are to me like a deceitful brook, like waters that fail. And
Absolutely. What a great line it is.
I mean, and I guess, along with so many of us, I've found myself again and again in the pastoral realities of my own life, but also I think of my ministry, turning to those bits of the Bible where the Bible is willing to say things to God that I think we, in our liturgies don't always find it easy to say. And this is the voice of someone who really, you know, in Christian terms, this is someone who knows what it is like to carry your cross, and actually to then discover that you didn't even get the help you thought you were going to get from the God who had told you to carry it. And I think that is just to find a way in our preaching to maybe let those words come in, again with all the caveats that you've both highlighted, about being very conscious that we don't know what's going on in the hearts and minds of those we're preaching to. We'll know some of their story. There's an awful lot of their story that quite rightly is hidden, and it's hidden from everyone else in the church, let alone from us as preachers. But to find a way to allow Jeremiah's voice to be heard, which is the voice of someone who is working their socks off, being faithful, and who is able to turn to God and say, you're a deceitful brook. You dried up on me. Now, what's interesting is that God then responds. I mean, it's a bit like Job, Job throws all the stuff.
It is.
God responds. What's interesting, I think it's a little, it is that, I think the beauty of Job is that in a sense, Job doesn't explain away suffering and why do bad things happen to good people. Job is doing something slightly different, and I think we get something slightly different. God doesn't come back at Jeremiah and say, no, actually, I was never a dried up, I was helping you. But what God does do is God says, actually, I'm going to continue to work in the mess of life. And I'm going to continue to call people back to me, including you, my prophet, who've just accused me of being a dried up brook. a deceitful brook. um, uh, and I'm going to carry on, and I think that was one of the things that spoke to me about it, which maybe resonates into the carrying your cross as well. There's something about abiding and carrying on, which again can be easily misused, carry on
Yeah.
in your suffering, carry on in that awful relationship, where God has put you, and so on. But this is God saying, I'm going to carry on, and I'm going to keep on calling you back to me. I'm going to keep on being with you. And I think maybe sometimes, I mean, I think of Jesus in Gethsemane, the same one who said, carry your cross, is the one who then in Gethsemane says, actually, if there's another way, can we please do plan B? And God seems to be the God who says, I will faithfully work with you, and sometimes you won't see me, and sometimes you'll want to accuse me of not being there. Carry on. Alex.
I just remembered as you were speaking, because what you spoke to it powerfully. That in the World Communion of Reformed Churches, the theme that we've chosen for our next General Assembly is persevere in your witness.
Right.
And we're really encouraging member churches, which includes the yrC, to look at what does it mean in the context of all of the struggling and suffering to persevere in our witness. And actually, that might be really relevant and helpful for folks to bring into conversation.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it, how often the Bible does let that voice be heard. I mean, there are many other voices, but there is that voice. And I mean, we get that from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Oh well, I mean, I think that's a really good one to throw in. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Because the hiddenness of God is perplexing. Was for Job, was for Jeremiah here, was for Jesus on the cross. Apparently, if you take those those statements that were in Matthew and Mark, but not in Luke and John, as being historical words of Jesus, did he really feel forsaken at that point? And I've got to say that here, I even thought in Jeremiah, there's something about God's answer that wasn't quite helpful for me. You rightly pointed out, Neil, it's a very amazing line. I've got, wilt thou be a deceitful brook, like waters that fail to me? Wilt thou be to me a deceitful brook that like waters that fail? And again, I think that's our experience sometimes. And you could argue that that's sort of the experience it feels like in the church to some extent. The terrible things that happen in life, and it doesn't sort of make sense. And here Jeremiah, as you say, was working his socks off and being faithful. And yet then God comes back and says, if you return, I will restore you, and you shall stand before me. If you utter what is precious and not what is worthless, you shall be as my mouth. They shall turn to you, but you shall not turn to them. And I will make you to this people a fortified wall of bronze. They will fight against you, but they shall not prevail over you. So there is a little bit, I think, there's still, if you're say the faithful things, if you do what I ask of you, then I'll make it right for you. The question always is how.
Sure.
How will he make it right for us? And what is this text trying to say by that? Because it certainly doesn't seem to me that if you're if you're good in every way, you'll get what you. Maybe it's Mick Jagger. You can't always get what you want, but you get what you need. I don't, I don't know. But
Yeah.
but certainly there's a hiddenness about God,
Yeah.
and the rewards don't line up the way
Yeah.
we want them to,
Yeah.
and we have to live with that.
Sure.
Uh,
Sure.
and yeah,
Yeah. And you know, as preachers, as folk walking the way of faith, we'll just be very conscious, won't we, of how so many times we're with people who are trying to hold together things that it's almost impossible to hold together. You know,
yeah,
faithfulness and suffering.
yeah. That's right. Yeah,
You know,
that's right.
okay.
Yeah, good. Yeah, lovely.
Anyway, I'm
Yeah,
conscious that time is rattling along, and I mean, we've certainly found no shortage of things to try and combine in preaching these texts, but there is more that we might want to do with them in worship. So, Alex, where else might you go?
Yeah, so you two and also people who watched last week might have gathered that I'm a bit into craftivism. But some of you might not know what craftivism means, so I'm going to go there before I talk about how you might use it. So craftivism combines craft and activism, and it was coined in 2003 by someone called Betsy Greer, in order to kind of join those two spheres. But she said when she defined it, craftivism is a way of looking at life where voicing opinions through creativity makes your voice stronger, your compassion deeper, and your quest for justice more infinite. So for her, it's not just about activism and not only to be used in an externally facing way, but it's actually about the processing of hard truths in a way that's good for our well-being, because we're putting something out there, whatever putting it out there means. An image example of this that I might use in a service is one that folks might have seen of traditional style embroidery. So perhaps a font with some floral cross stitch around it, with a contemporary message that might say something along the lines of "this sucks." Some of them are totally inappropriate to use in churches, so do be a little bit careful if you're Googling for these types of things. But if you Google contemporary quote embroidery, you'll find lots of things there that might be relevant to your context. And of course, it's a good way of bringing that contemporary feeling of young adults, many of whom are activists, into a church context, because lots of people in church embroider, including me. So to actually bring something that we understand into the contemporary context might be really helpful. You might, if your church is up for it, consider some craftivism activities, and there are some really simple ones that anyone can do. So if you're thinking of that taking up your cross scenario, you might want to bring some twigs and some colored cotton, and you simply hold the two twigs together in a cross and use the colored cotton to wrap round the join to create a cross. And those can be given out or left in places. That's fully biodegradable, so that's not a problem to leave around if you want to share the message of taking up your cross with others, or indeed if people just want to take it home to remind them. And then secondly, just writing, painting, or sewing messages, depending what folks are interested in and what's good for them. But something about some of the trouble and the hurt that we perceive in ourselves or in the world, finding ways to express those that externalize them, and might also be a way to share some messages outside of our space.
Brilliant. Yeah. Craftivism, right? Yeah. Very good. Very good. You'll hopefully have sent a good few of us into the internet to find and read a bit more. Fabulous. Thank you. Blair.
Yes, I think I do a little bit more with, again, what I would do with children, on the theme of dying to ourselves, or so that something new might be born through Christ. And I like, there's so much in nature that you can do with this theme. You know, the cocoon and the butterfly, of course. But I'm thinking of the seed how a seed, and I think I could take some seeds to church and show the kids, or it could be on the screen. You could show them what a seed is made up of, and the shell on the inside, and in what's outside, and what's on the inside. And as I understand it, the moment of germination is when the shell cracks and the shoot it expands out of itself. What the inside bit cracks the outside bit, and that's the kind of dying to the seed that it was for something new, and that that will give life to beyond itself. So yeah, I think that's sort of fascinating stuff in nature, and I think it's true for us that we become pretty hardened on the outside in a way over the years, and you could argue that needs to be cracked again and again, so that something new through the power of God's Spirit comes to life, that is better, that is life-giving.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. I had a couple of thoughts. One was the thought of taking that psalm, and I mean, if that sense of its origin is right, that this is a psalm, this is a liturgical way of someone actually who's been vindicated. Taking that as an idea and thinking about our prayers, and maybe using, I mean, having to be careful again, because it'd be very easy to just end up with something that sounded very me-centered, and just, especially if you were using it liturgically in prayer, you've got to be conscious that you're trying to craft something that actually is a prayer of the people rather than just your own stuff. But finding a way in a prayer to perhaps acknowledge before God and as a community things that we are grateful for, where things have been turned around. And those could be things turned around within the life of a congregation, but they could also be things turned around within the life of a community. I mean, I think often in our prayers of intercession, we tend to go to God with a whole list of things we'd like God to turn around. I wonder how often we find a way to give voice in our prayers of thanksgiving and thankfulness, and indeed intercession, acknowledging where there has been a transformation that has been good, perhaps where someone who we have been praying for who's been very ill is no longer as ill, or whatever. And I know pastorally there's a lot going on there, but Psalm 26 maybe invites a bit of experimenting along those lines. And then the other thing that I was thinking about, and again thinking about the physicality of worship, and it would all depend on your worship space and where you were doing this, and a bit of preparation in advance. But it might be kind of fun to do something with some really dried up soil, some soil that was really dry and cracked, so that as you got to, if you were using the Jeremiah, as you were talking about the Jeremiah, there was actually a focal point in the worship space that was a dried up brook. But you could also then have a jug of water, and the pouring of the water onto the soil could be an invitation to think about what does it mean that God is at work in these situations where there is this tremendous dryness. And if you did it right, if you organized it right, I mean, the water would probably disappear down the cracks of the dry soil. The dry soil would still look dry, but underneath there would be some moisture. And that in itself might be an interesting visual way of thinking about what that Jeremiah text is maybe hinting at. And again, I'd want to do that with a lot of care in terms of not just putting out bland statements about, how God is working everything to God's good in the end, because there'll be people listening thinking, well, it doesn't feel like that to me right now. But that might just be a way of opening up that passage. So there you are. There's
Yeah.
a few things.
Can I
Anything
just
else?
react a little bit to the first thing that you said about an honest prayer? It does capture my imagination a little bit, not with respect to the psalmist, but to Jeremiah. Him saying, I've done all of these things, and basically, where has it got me? I what did he do? Thy words were found, I ate them. Thy words came to me a joy. Uh, for I am called by thy name. I did not sit in the company of merrymakers. I sat alone, because thy hand was upon me. Why is my pain unceasing?
Yeah.
And why have you become like a dry brook to me?
Yeah.
I does not wonder whether you were talking about how you could make that a community prayer, not just an individual. You could have quite an honest prayer with God, involving the people of the congregation, saying things. We've been faithful. All you could say in the beginning of the prayer, you could say we've been, we preached to, we've done our church services, we've believed the gospel. Whereas it's gotten, our churches are smaller, are elderly. We're on our way out. Where are you?
Yeah.
You could have that sort of prayer where you have that sort of honest language about how bad it is, and
Yeah.
in terms of the degeneration of the church. And then you could have a second part of the prayer, maybe saying, but maybe we didn't preach as well as we thought we could, and we didn't go out as much as we could have, and we maybe didn't, we misconstrued the message, we made it into our own, and we didn't see that we have to keep changing.
Yep.
And that we believe that if we're more true to your message, and see to the ways that you are working in the world today, we can be, again, serve you well and be the church you want us to be. So something like that.
Yeah.
You can imagine a real honest.
Yep.
As the psalmist captures our imagination with his honesty, saying, "Look, this is just really bad. You're like a dry brook to me." Sometimes it's important for us to say that out loud and in our prayers as well, in a way that relates to our context. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, we've been talking absolute worship, and we've traveled some significant journeys with these texts, and we know that you will too, and we want to bless you as you do, as you get ready to open these texts in your setting. So Blair is going to finish off in prayer for us.
We pray. Gracious God, we give thanks for this time together today, and we pray blessings upon all preachers this week who are wrestling with these texts and who want to speak a word that is true to you. Be with them as they prepare, we pray, that they might speak a word that gives new life, that might involve some dying, but ultimately is life-giving to their people. And we ask all that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.